Climate cakeism is in full flow. The Chancellor would have us believe that there's no conflict at all between GDP economic growth and pursuing net zero, something which also the Secretary of State for DESNZ tells us too. Keir Starmer would tell us and have us believe the same as Boris Johnson. No need to change your lifestyle. You just keep on flying. It's all going to be fine. So it's win-win. We're going to have a cleaner economy, no longer causing climate change. And you know what? It's all going to be cheaper and it's all going to deliver economic growth. Sound too good to be true? Well, it is too good to be true. But what's to come between a good political story and a good political line and the more difficult reality that we're all going to have to face? Now, you might say, well, how do they get away with this stuff? Do people really believe it? Well, part of the art of politics is to frame a question which gives the answer you'd like to have. And in the case of net zero, it couldn't be clearer. Climate change is global. It doesn't matter where emissions take place. Surely we all understand that. And therefore, what matters is not where emissions take place, not the territorial emissions, but who causes the consumption which brings forth those emissions wherever they might be. But net zero targets, and indeed the UN COP targets, are designed precisely to avoid those obvious connections. It's all about territorial carbon emissions. What's emitted, for example, inside the UK is what counts towards our target. And even better, these territorial emissions are measured to exclude Drax, perhaps the most polluting power station in the whole of Europe, burning its wood pellets. So, worthwhile subsidising Drax some more, because if we didn't, our emissions count would be higher, and then the record would not be quite as good as politicians would like us to have. So, given the way we measure net zero, there is no problem with Drax. In fact, Drax is a positive benefit in achieving our net zero target. And even better, we can go on cutting our territorial emissions by switching as much production of energy-intensive stuff out of the UK to abroad. So, close down Grangemouth, tick, emissions go down, we're doing better on the path to net zero. Import the stuff instead from elsewhere. Doesn't count against our target, so we're doing even better on our target. But of course, we're doing worse when it comes to our impact on climate change. Close down primary steel production in Port Talbot. Another great tick in the box. End fertiliser production in the UK. Another tick in the net zero box. And so on and so forth. This is all smoke and mirrors. And the political framing of the target gives the out and the ability for politicians to boast about the achievements that are being made, whether it be Boris Johnson or it be Keir Starmer or whoever. Defence, by the way, will be a bit trickier, particularly if we have to make our own steel to make our own tanks rather than import that from China, which would be slightly difficult from a military perspective. But it's not just the politicians that frame things in these ways and give us the cakeism story. We have full-blown cakeism from the Climate Change Committee. The hundreds of pages, 400 and something pages of the 7th Carbon Budget are detailed and have lots and lots of really good analysis within them. But that's not the point. It's the headlines that count. And one of the most bizarre things about the Climate Change Committee's report is their claim that electricity or energy bills will be £700 cheaper in 2050. And it'll be £700 cheaper to run an electric car than it will be to run a conventional internal combustion engine. Well, it might be true, but how the hell would they know Do you have any idea what the gas price in, say, 2 or 3 years' time is going to be? I don't. It's a huge range of possibilities. But never mind. The Climate Change Committee can tell you that in a quarter of a century's time, they know the differential between the price of so-called net zero energy and the alternatives. Really? This is absurd. And not only is it absurd, it's basically propaganda. And it should be seen as such. The Climate Change Committee is supposed to be a technical, objective advisor. It is not supposed to be an advocate. And yet, if you listen to the TV and radio interviews over the last few days, it's in full advocacy mode. And it goes back to John Gummer, who told us that when we get to net zero, we will no longer be causing climate change. Really? Well, of course we will, because we'll be importing loads of stuff, which is carbon intensive. And if we go on the current path, we'll be producing virtually nothing that's energy and carbon intensive in the UK. It'll all be coming from abroad. Even those wind turbines and solar panels, all the parts, the minerals, the refining, all the stuff that goes into them, where's it come from? Not from the UK. Doesn't count in our territorial emissions. It's carbon consumption that would measure those, and we'd include those emissions caused in making that stuff to produce our so-called net zero energy in the UK. Well, here we are, cakeism in full flow. Win, win, win. And we have the Climate Change Committee, NESO, Ofgem, and the Secretary of State all in unison with the same press releases about unlocking stuff, unleashing stuff, prices are going to come down, and all the full cakeist story. And the trouble is, it's all pretty difficult, and not just difficult further out. You know, who can tell what the price of electricity is going to be from net zero kit in 2050, in quarter of a century's time? You know, quite a lot of us will be dead by then, so nobody will be held for account for what they're saying today. And with 400 and something pages behind it, it's perfectly plausible for the Climate Change Committee to say, hey, you know, look, we've done all the analysis, read our report, as if most of the public, and indeed most of the people who work in these industries, is actually going to sit down and read all this stuff. And there are really inconvenient moments in the short run which play into this. You know, you can't help feeling quite a lot of sympathy for how uncomfortable our Secretary of State for DESNZ must feel about Gatwick, about Heathrow, about City Airport, about the boosting of aviation and aviation flights. Now, there's maybe good decisions to make. It pretends to imagine that it's politically sustainable to say to people, you know, you can't fly. But on the other hand, it's not consistent with what would really have to be done if we really wanted to stop causing climate change. And it's beholden on politicians to tell us that in the choices we make, we are choosing not to stop causing climate change. And that may be what we want. That's what the opinion polls suggest. We like living beyond our climate and our environmental means, and we sure as hell intend to go on doing so. And you have to be a brave politician to put a roadblock or a bulldozer in the way to stop the public, the voters, getting what they want. But you really should stop pretending that you're on the path to cheaper net zero, etc., as the Secretary of State does. You should be straightforward. If you really believe the stuff that you've said in the past, and you really believe that aviation has to be curtailed, then you should resign. That's the honourable thing to do. Instead of saying, oh, well, you know, okay, that's fine, that's collective decision making. Well, it is, but it's not consistent with the advocacy of the policy which our Secretary of State would have. We have also the other inconvenient problems, which will have to be addressed now. How is it that if all this stuff is going to be cheaper, and we've been told that for 15 years now, if not more, under Conservative governments and now with this government, how is it that we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world? How is it that Germany, which is the other country that pursued a Energiewende, as it called it at the time, is pretty close behind on those prices? I mean, how are we going to go on doing this? Well, perhaps it's a good thing. Perhaps it means that energy-intensive industries will leave, and then the territorial emissions targets will look better. We'll just have more carbon pollution, more climate change, but it'll happen overseas in a distant land beyond our imagination, perhaps. How is it that we have about the fifth highest domestic electricity prices in the EU, and vastly higher than in the United States as our industrial prices? These sit rather uncomfortably. And what they really tell you, along with the decision about Drax, which is, let's say, from a climate change position, unfortunate at best, what these decisions tell us is that there is a dimension of the Climate Change Committee's sixth carbon budget, which came out a while ago, and the current now new seventh carbon budget, and that is that it really is impossible to imagine a transition which does not require lifestyle changes. And what that means is that our carbon consumption will have to go down. And when we say our carbon consumption, it's not about what companies are doing, though they're an important part of the frame. It's what you and I do. And if we really wanted to stop causing climate change, as John Gummer mistakenly claimed about the net zero targets, but if we really wanted to do it, if we really cared about this, then it's pretty clear that moving from a state where we don't pay for the pollution we cause to a state where we do is going to hit us and hit our consumption. The sustainable level of consumption, consistent with no longer causing climate change, is significantly lower than the current level of consumption. And you can see the political difficulties that go with that. And it's really interesting if you look at the media coverage of the Climate Change Committee's seventh carbon budget. What people go for is, oh, does it mean we're going to have to eat less meat? Does it mean we're going to have to fly less? Does it mean that family holiday to Spain, the flight is going to cost us, £150 more or something along those lines? These are the things that hit raw nerves. And the Climate Change Committee has been really rather politically astute, not its role to be politically astute, by the way, in pussyfooting around these topics this time around, which it didn't do last time when Chris Stark was at the head, because it knows that we, ultimately, the voters and the consumers, do not want to pay for the pollution we're causing. So the next time you hear the happy-clappy cakeism around climate change from our politicians, just as we heard it from Boris Johnson and Theresa May and others in the last decade, next time you hear it, just stand back and ask yourself, is it really plausible? Is it really possible that we can have our cake and eat it too? Economic growth, be the powerhouse of the world, the location of the cheapest energy where energy-intensive industries will be flocking to in the future, with happy consumers or with £700 off their bill in a quarter of a century's time. I don't think it's plausible, and I don't think it's right to spin all this in a format which deludes us that we're not going to have to face up to the costs. And let's be clear, we should pay, but telling people it's all cakeism, you won't have to pay, isn't going to make the world any less prone to the increasing temperatures. On the contrary, it's the path, like the path we've been on since 1990, of ever more increases in the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And that's what counts. That's why we've gone through 1.5. That's why we'll go on that path. And that's why the UK's net zero territorial carbon target and all the spin around it won't make much difference to the outcome. It could even, in some respects, make it worse. So if you're honest about climate change, cut the spin, cut the advocacy, get back to the basic fundamentals of independent analysis and advice, and stop telling the public all the porkies that go with the win-win-win scenarios. Too good to be true? Yeah, it is too good to be true. And that's the reality of climate change and why we're finding it so hard to tackle it. Thank you very much.